The year was 1071, and in the lavish halls of the Doge's palace in Venice, a Byzantine princess was about to commit an act so shocking, so blasphemous, that it would scandalize all of Christian Europe and forever change how humans ate their food. What you're about to hear is the true story of the first fork, and how using this simple eating utensil was considered such a grave sin against God that it could damn your soul for eternity. This isn't just about table manners or medieval superstition. This is about a religious controversy so intense that it influenced papal policy, sparked riots across Europe, and revealed the terrifying power of the Church to control even the most basic aspects of daily life. The fork wars of medieval Europe would determine whether humans could touch their food, or whether doing so was an act of rebellion against divine will. Picture medieval Europe in the 11th century, a continent where every aspect of life was governed by religious doctrine, where the Catholic Church held absolute authority over not just spiritual matters, but every detail of human behavior. Eating was considered a sacred act, a direct connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. And the Church had very specific ideas about how God intended humans to consume their food. According to medieval Christian doctrine, humans were created in God's image, and that meant using the body exactly as God had designed it. The fingers were considered divine instruments, blessed appendages that God had specifically provided for handling food. To use artificial tools to replace what God had given you was to reject His perfect design, to declare that you knew better than the Creator Himself. The crisis began when Princess Maria Argyropoulos of Byzantium married Domenico Selvo, the Doge of Venice. As part of her dowry, she brought with her a collection of golden eating implements that were completely unknown in Western Europe. Small, two-pronged instruments that allowed food to be speared and lifted to the mouth without touching it with human hands. What we would recognize today as primitive forks, but to the religious authorities of medieval Venice, these implements were instruments of the devil. The princess was essentially importing satanic technology into Christian Europe. Tools that defied God's will and represented a fundamental rejection of divine authority. The reaction was swift, brutal, and would reshape European society for centuries to come. The theological argument against forks was surprisingly sophisticated. Church scholars pointed out that Christ Himself had eaten with His hands, that the apostles had never used artificial eating implements, and that centuries of Christian tradition supported hand-to-mouth consumption as the only acceptable method. To use forks was to declare yourself superior to Jesus, to reject the example of the saints, and to embrace a form of pride that was inherently sinful. But the opposition went deeper than simple theological concerns. Medieval Christians believed that touching food with your hands was a form of blessing, that the transfer of human warmth and energy sanctified the meal and made it spiritually nourishing. Using artificial implements created a barrier between the eater and their food, preventing this sacred connection and essentially turning every meal into a spiritually empty act. The Church also argued that fork use demonstrated a sinful level of vanity and luxury. Only someone consumed with pride would consider their hands too precious to touch food. The simple act of using a fork was seen as evidence of spiritual corruption, a sign that the user valued worldly elegance over godly humility. It was the kind of behavior that led directly to damnation. Princess Maria became the target of vicious attacks from religious authorities throughout Europe. Priests delivered sermons denouncing her eating habits as evidence of foreign corruption. Monks wrote treatises explaining how fork use violated fundamental Christian principles. Even bishops who had never met her condemned her behavior as a threat to the spiritual health of all Christendom. The princess tried to defend her practices by pointing out that forks prevented food from becoming contaminated by dirty hands, that they were more sanitary and refined than finger eating. But these arguments only made things worse. The Church interpreted her concern with cleanliness as evidence of spiritual pride, and her preference for refinement as proof that she had been corrupted by worldly values. The psychological pressure was enormous. Princess Maria found herself essentially excommunicated from polite society. Nobles refused to dine with her. Merchants wouldn't sell to her household. Even servants began leaving her employment rather than risk association with her diabolic eating practices. She had become a pariah simply for using eating utensils that seemed perfectly normal in her homeland. The situation escalated when other Italian nobles began experimenting with forks themselves. Influenced by Maria's example, some wealthy Venetians started using the strange new implements at private dinners. This triggered a moral panic that spread across the peninsula, as church authorities realized they were facing not just one wayward princess, but a potential revolution in eating practices. Pope Alexander II issued a formal condemnation of fork use in 1072, declaring that anyone who employed artificial eating implements was guilty of excessive delicacy and sinful pride. The papal decree specifically stated that using forks was tantamount to rejecting God's design for the human body, and could result in excommunication for repeat offenders. The fork had officially become a tool of Satan. The enforcement was brutal and systematic. Church authorities began conducting eating inspections at noble households, looking for evidence of fork use and punishing violators. Servants were encouraged to report on their master's dining habits. Children were taught to identify and denounce fork users. The medieval equivalent of eating police began patrolling dinner tables across Europe. The penalties for fork use escalated rapidly. Initial violations resulted in public penance, kneeling outside churches and confessing the sin of artificial eating. Repeat offenders faced fines, imprisonment, and social ostracism. In extreme cases, particularly stubborn fork users could be charged with heresy, a crime punishable by burning at the stake. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Artisans who had begun crafting forks found their businesses destroyed overnight. Merchants who imported eating implements from Byzantine territories faced criminal charges. Even metalworkers who created spoons became suspect, as church authorities worried that any artificial eating tool could lead to spiritual corruption. But the fork controversy revealed something disturbing about medieval Christianity's relationship with the human body. While the church claimed that hands were divinely designed for eating, they simultaneously taught that the human body was inherently sinful and corrupt. This contradiction created impossible standards. God's design was perfect, but also fundamentally flawed, requiring constant vigilance and control. The medical establishment initially supported the church's position. Medieval physicians argued that using forks disrupted the natural flow of bodily humors, that the artificial barrier between hand and food prevented proper digestion. Some doctors claimed that fork users were more susceptible to disease, madness, and spiritual possession. These weren't fringe opinions. They were mainstream medical doctrine that reinforced religious prejudice. Princess Maria's fate became a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying church authority. When she died in 1063, just 2 years after her marriage, religious authorities declared that her death was divine punishment for her sinful eating practices. Priests used her demise as proof that God would not tolerate fork use, and that anyone who followed her example would face similar consequences. But the most shocking aspect of the fork controversy was how it spread beyond eating to influence every aspect of daily life. If using artificial implements to handle food was sinful, what about using tools for other activities? Some extremist religious groups began arguing that any technology that replaced natural human capabilities was inherently evil, leading to attacks on everything from plows to writing instruments. The fork prohibition created a complex underground culture of secret eating. Wealthy Europeans who had acquired forks would use them only in private, hidden from servants and guests who might report their violations. Some nobles developed elaborate codes and signals for communicating about fork availability, treating eating utensils like contraband weapons in a holy war. The international implications were equally bizarre. European diplomats refused to attend state dinners in Byzantine territories if forks were provided. Merchants conducting business in the East had to guarantee they wouldn't use artificial eating implements. The fork controversy became a major obstacle to trade and diplomacy between Western and Eastern Christianity. Some creative individuals tried to find compromise that would satisfy religious authorities while still providing the benefits of fork use. Ornate gloves designed specifically for eating, elaborate finger guards that kept hands clean while technically maintaining direct contact with food, special blessed utensils that had been sanctified by priests. None of these solutions satisfied the Church's fundamental objection to artificial eating aids. The breakthrough came gradually, as practical considerations began to override religious scruples. The growth of trade with Eastern Europe and the Middle East exposed more Europeans to fork-using cultures. Improved metalworking techniques made forks more available and affordable. And slowly, very slowly, religious opposition began to weaken. The turning point arrived in the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas, the Church's greatest theologian, addressed the fork controversy in his philosophical writings. While he didn't explicitly endorse fork use, he argued that tools which improved human capabilities without replacing divine design might be acceptable under certain circumstances. This theological wiggle room allowed gradual acceptance of eating implements. But the transition wasn't smooth or universal. Many regions maintained fork prohibitions well into the Renaissance. Some religious communities never fully accepted artificial eating implements. And even today, certain Christian denominations maintain traditions of hand-only eating during religious ceremonies, viewing it as a more authentic expression of faith. The psychological legacy of the fork wars lasted for centuries. Europeans who grew up during the Prohibition often retained anxiety about using eating implements, passing down fears about divine punishment for artificial eating to their children. Some families maintained secret traditions of hand-only dining even after forks became socially acceptable, treating proper eating as a form of religious observance. Modern historians studying the fork controversy have identified it as a crucial turning point in the relationship between religious authority and technological innovation. The Church's eventual acceptance of forks established precedents for dealing with new technologies, creating frameworks that would later be applied to everything from printing presses to scientific instruments. The story also reveals how arbitrary many religious prohibitions actually were. The theological arguments against forks were elaborate and sophisticated, but ultimately based on cultural preferences rather than fundamental spiritual principles. The same religious authorities who condemned artificial eating implements enthusiastically endorsed tools for warfare, agriculture, and construction. The prohibition wasn't really about divine design. It was about maintaining control over cultural change. The economic transformation that followed fork acceptance was enormous. The eating implement industry became a major sector of medieval manufacturing, generating wealth for artisans, merchants, and raw material suppliers across Europe. The end of the fork prohibition essentially created an entire new economy based on dining refinement and table etiquette. The social changes were equally significant. As forks became acceptable, they evolved from simple functional tools into symbols of social status and sophistication. The ability to use eating implements properly became a mark of education and refinement, creating new forms of class distinction based on dining behavior rather than just wealth or birth. But perhaps the most important lesson from the medieval fork controversy is about the power of religious authority to shape even the most basic human behaviors. For over 2 centuries, European Christians genuinely believed that their eternal salvation could depend on how they ate their food. The Church had successfully convinced millions of people that God cared deeply about their dining implements. This demonstrates how completely religious institutions can control human behavior when they claim divine authority. The same psychological mechanisms that made fork prohibition possible have been used throughout history to justify countless other restrictions on human freedom. From clothing regulations to marriage laws to restrictions on education and travel. The next time someone claims that religious authority should determine social policy or personal behavior, remember the medieval Christians who believed that using a fork could damn their souls. Because when institutions claim to speak for God, even the most absurd restrictions can seem not just reasonable, but absolutely necessary for salvation. If stories about how religious extremism has shaped human culture in unexpected ways fascinate you, Subscribe to The Gray Hour for more explorations of the strange intersections between faith and daily life. Because understanding how religious authority has been used to control human behavior is essential for protecting our freedom to make our own choices about how we live.